All right, folks, we're going to go through a couple of just basic things for you to keep in mind while you're working through your desktop design work. Um, I don't want to repeat all the content that I've already mentioned for tablet and mobile. I would say that a lot of those principles actually carry over to desktop design. I think for the purposes of this video, I wanted to talk more about the differences between designing for a desktop app and a mobile app. So let me switch over to that here. Okay, so again, this video will be pretty short, but I want you to be able to, by the end of the week, take away some of the basic differences between designing for a desktop app or a desktop website. Um, Of course, I would like you to continue considering the specific use cases for the person who is using your product. So there is, to some extent, a sense of consistency. Of course, we want the functionality that's available on mobile and tablet to also be available on desktop. However, there may be specific tasks or functionality that will be most accessible on the desktop. So things that might require multiple inputs, like being able to type something in with a keyboard, or be able to use a mouse to point and click on something for manipulation or sharing, or other kind of more detailed interaction purposes. You'll also, with this information, start applying it to your design work for your project submission at the end of the week. So some of the ways that this connects to your long-term like UX design goals would be that desktop design work and desktop tools in general are predominantly used for more complicated tasks. So for instance, being able to edit a full-length video or to create CGI, animations, or being able to use Photoshop to manipulate an image. Those things, although you can do some of it on your mobile phone or your tablet, some of the more detailed interactions and this really focused work has to be done on a desktop. And that's primarily for ergonomics, meaning that we have to design the experience of how to use the programs and the hardware, not just the experience on the digital interface. So when it comes to being able to design for an optimum workflow, you have to consider how someone will physically be in their physical state. So are they sitting at a computer? Are they standing up? Do they have a mouse? Do they have a point and click, or do they have a trackpad that they have to use? Is their keyboard connected or detached, wired, Bluetooth, etc.? So there's a lot of things to consider. With desktop, of course, we've got a lot more design space that we can work with. What that means is that there's an even more significant uh, idea that you have to take hierarchy and information density. You have to keep that in mind while you actually put together your designs. So I sometimes see projects have a lot of content on the screen just because they have the space, and that's not what I'm advocating for at all. I still want you to be frugal with the space and use what you need. But I want to make sure that you also make good use of the space as well. So let's take, for instance, if you were designing the Airbnb product. So on your mobile app, you would expect that you can book a place, you can research stays and research rooms, be able to find specific dates or specific location, um, sort and filter, and eventually place a transaction of sorts. And that seems, fairly detailed already. There's a lot of breadth in there. With a desktop, you have the opportunity to investigate the interactions for all of those things that we've just named, but also to take it one step further. So in the case where I see search results for places to stay, I can see it in a couple of different ways. I can look at a map and zoom in and out and see the little pins on the map that tell me how much it would cost for my stay. On that same view, I can also have a list view where I can see the individual listings and some really basic information about them. And if it's interesting, I can tap through or click through. Um, I could also use more detailed sorting and filtering mechanisms and actually have it surfaced on that first screen versus having sorting and filtering kind of buried into a second page or into a flyout menu. I could actually just have everything on that same screen so that I can reference the filters to the actual content underneath. Um, you'll need to factor in all of that functionality that you want to pursue for your product, but then also balance it with the amount of content you need to put on the screen. So when it comes to information density, we don't, of course, want to overload our users with all the functionality and all the content that's available to them, but you have to provide enough information for them to take the next step with it. So I think MySpace had this issue, and to some point, like AOL and MSN also had this issue where they tried to just put too much up front on the same screen just because they had the space to do it. And that doesn't always mean that it's above the fold either. So, like when you first load the page, whatever you see on your screen, that's what's above the fold, if you will. And then if you start scrolling, anything that's below, anything that needs to be accessed by scrolling, that's what's called below the fold. But MySpace, AOL and MSN did this job, I wouldn't say great, but did a job of actually putting a lot of content on that front page, and it almost looked like a newspaper. So if you go out and you look at a newspaper, like the one that's folded into fours, not a weekly publication that you'd pick out of a newsstand, but maybe like the New York Times or the LA Times, the amount of content that shows up on that full length newspaper was a practice that they just tried to replicate for digital, but it didn't work. So in this case, your projects are very specific and very detailed. I don't expect a lot of information on that first screen that I see, mostly because, again, this desktop technology is meant for people to consume over time and to really get a detailed sense of what it's like to use your product. So don't feel that you have to cram everything all on the same screen. You can still space it out and use your design aesthetic, but just know that you need to still balance the amount of content with its level of importance, so its hierarchy. As a review for you, so the desktop design philosophy was called the lean back philosophy, meaning that you take a lot of time working on a specific task. So, for instance, if you're typing a paper for school, you're probably using a desktop or a laptop, and that could be due to a number of different things. It could mean that the physical setup just lends itself to that task. The physical setup would probably also include hardware, so maybe a larger monitor, a keyboard that's a physical keyboard, or could be attached or detached from your computer, depending on if it's like a tabletop computer or if it's a laptop. You may also have a secondary mouse that you use to click around. So the combination of this hardware and the additional real estate compounded with the physical environment allows you to more or less comfortably spend time on those detailed tasks. We've also seen in the industry the use of these technologies where you lean back and you're sitting down, used for things like heavy research. So if someone is comparing different vacation packages, it's easier for them to be able to tab through multiple windows or tabs to look at vacation packages in Jamaica and in Portugal and in Antarctica versus having to tab quote unquote on a mobile device and having to go back to the browser app bar and open up another window and kind of ping pong back and forth. The ping pong was what we call it internally on my team at Amazon. It's kind of this act of going from one page to another, back to that source page, out to another, back to the source page, out to another, etc. So being able to view that detailed information and do that heavy research tends to be done more in desktops just because, again, the physical environment lends itself to those interactions. And I think by default, we can really just infer that desktops are generally just used for more complicated tasks. So yes, I can film a video and make some adjustments to the color and saturation, maybe clip it so that it's not as long. But if I wanted to do like real heavy duty video editing, I would probably have to import that video into iMovie or Pro Tools or, I'm sorry, Final Cut or Premiere so that I can actually do a more detailed like video edit. I'd be able to, again, do a little bit of it on my mobile device. It would be very simplistic, but anything that requires more detailed work, I would have to kind of send over to my desktop. So depending on the product that you're designing, there are certain use cases that I want you to consider while you're discussing with your team which method is better for you, so either app or website. So will your users need to browse the web? So is there an opportunity where you link out to other articles or things that are external to your site? If so, it might be better to keep things on a desktop website than in a desktop app, because an app, let's say you have an app like Microsoft Word, for example, if you were to need to create a link that opens up another window, so in this case, Word would open up Google Chrome, for example, that could become a little bit annoying for your users if they're not really expecting your experience to have to that they have to toggle between two different programs to do it. So in cases like that, where there's a lot of browsing content for a website, I would definitely recommend just keeping everything in one place on a website and not in an app. So an app should be more all-inclusive. Um, when we think about desktop use cases as well, something else to consider is if this user will need to create content. So a lot of the consumer apps that exist now are more about consumption, surprise. So it means that you're looking at content, you're consuming it, you are taking in information, but you are not so much producing information. So in the case where they have to produce content, so if it was Instagram, instead of just looking at the feed and tapping on things and liking them, what if Instagram were actually more so used for content creation? So actually having the photo editing tools or video editing tools up front, as well as a camera up front versus having the feed first. That kind of gives a different perspective and twist on what that product looks like. So again, that's what I want you to consider with your product. Is this something that requires active engagement? And if so, what does that active engagement look like? If it requires more passive engagement, meaning I open this for information and I'm not consistently diving in and creating very complex, like complex interactions, or needing to use multiple pieces of hardware to communicate or to interact with your product, then you might be able to decide between website and app. If your user will have to input really detailed data, such as finding models or source code, I think anyone in this class working those types of products. But in the where you need someone to type a lot of things to set really build setting, or to make like multi-step decisions, I would consider using a larger screen space, being able to use a website or an app in order to achieve that. You can also use desktop experiences for really intricate research. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that ping-ponging between different tabs or different browser windows. Intricate research can also be like database driven. So maybe you have to go onto LexisNexis or Google Scholar to look at information, and it requires you to spend a lot of time reading. Sometimes it's easier based on the screen size to just read more content than it would be trying to read a biology study on your phone, for example. And again, because of this physical, real world setup where things go beyond the digital screen, there's a desk, there's a seat usually, power connection, etc. Usually anything that requires more focus and more attention is generally kind of relegated to desktop. So the more heavy lifting interactions. So some questions to ask yourself in your future projects whether or not to support desktop design is considering the problem that you're solving. So if your particular product or problem statement is more about portability, mobility, staying connected on the go, perhaps a desktop experience is not for you. There are just inherent benefits that come with mobile designs and tablet designs that you won't be able to achieve as well on desktop. So I would go back and revisit some of the whys of kind of your reasoning behind designing for tablet and mobile and see if that's enough. Or if you examine with your user base that there's expectation for more detailed interactions, then a desktop experience might be helpful. That said, being able to know your audience is also very helpful. Generally, you can work from a persona or proto persona. Sometimes business development or marketing can provide profiles, if not personas. So a profile would give you some basic information on expectations and the types of things that these users are looking to solve in their everyday world. One important piece of information that you'll need to uncover either through partnering with other folks on the project or doing your own research is understanding the kind of devices they use to access your product. So in this case, if you're designing a civic product for a government, will they be using their own phones to connect to your product? Will they be using a shared device like a public library computer? Will it require a data plan, which they might not have? These are considerations that you need to think about when you make your decisions to support desktop. You should also consider what the technical capabilities are of those devices. So if we were just to scrap the technical capabilities of the person using those devices, if we only thought about the devices themselves, you would need to understand what your computer is capable of before designing for it. So if you're looking at, again, let's go back to the example of designing for Airbnb. Are you looking to have them sign in with any information, any login information they might have on their computer? Are you looking to pull in GPS using the data services or location services on their desktop device? Do they need to connect other hardware to your product to make this work? So just consider all the capabilities that your specific device has and either design around that or design around the right device that will provide the optimal experience. And then, of course, I think I mentioned this in my earlier point, try to be cognizant of where and how they will access your product. So again, if it's a shared device, it would be very difficult to download a desktop app versus being able to log in to a desktop website. Or if one will require significantly more data than the other. So I've used the word or the phrase desktop app and desktop website quite a bit. I've tried to make very concrete differences or to explain those concrete differences between the two, but I want to use this slide as an opportunity to do so again. So generally an app, whether for phone, tablet, or desktop, it requires a download. So this person needs to have connection to the internet. It could be either wired or through Wi-Fi or by tethering to their cell phone. So this data can cost them money. It will require computer memory space as well. So if you're downloading something, it means something's being saved to your computer. So in cases where someone has, very little desktop memory space, this is something to keep in mind. If this is a shared computer, that's also something to keep in mind. So if you were to have a banking app that was a desktop experience, so like a desktop app that you download, you may not want someone to download the Bank of America mobile banking app for Macs onto a school Mac where everybody else can access that information. So keep that in mind. In some cases, an app may require internet access to fully access the content available. So, for instance, with Amazon Music, I need to be connected to the internet in order to use the music player that I download on my laptop. There are cases with other media services like Netflix. I don't know about desktop. You can do it on mobile and tablet. Being able to save something locally on your device and have it delete after you've used the content. Oh, with the desktop app, there's also an expectation that someone can use it both online and offline. So being able to download something and being able to operate that app in the absence of being connected online. So, for example, if you were to download Adobe Photoshop on your computer, you would expect to be able to use Adobe Photoshop whether or not you were connected to the internet. Of course, they have cloud capabilities, so you can upload your content to the cloud, and you don't have to store it locally on your computer if you don't want to. But there's an expectation that you can actually use your product offline, and that's very different with a website. The last thing to keep in mind with desktop apps is that you may need to consider a custom download app if what you want to achieve with your product cannot be done using current web technologies. So there are just certain things that will be not necessarily easier, um, but at least from your perspective, but from an engineering perspective, there will just be things um, that are more in scope and more realistic um, when it comes to engineering something on the app versus trying to replicate that type of functionality for the website. Um, from a design perspective, pixels are pixels, we're moving things around, we're animating things, and we're looking at the product from a very high level perspective. But when it comes to implementation, there will be differences in functionality that we're able to pull from. So these are things that you'll have to discuss with the team that will build your product um, if you continue pursuing this outside of class. For a desktop website, on the other hand, um, you will, like 99% of the time, actually require internet connection in order to access the website. There are sites or products like Google Drive, for example, that where you can enable offline access. In some cases, like with Amazon Music and Netflix, you can also do the same thing. But in this case, anytime you want to access that that website, that product as a website, you need to have internet connection. So whether that's again hardwired, wireless, or tethering with your phone, it requires a data connection in order to use and to consume your product. There's also an expectation that if you're loading if you're loading a website, the content is actually stored somewhere else. So you're not loading all of the content files into someone's computer when they access your website. Everything is loaded somewhere else. So you are just a temporary visitor on that site. Whereas with a product that's downloaded to a computer like Photoshop, those files live on your computer. You know exactly where they are. There's a benefit of designing a desktop website in that you can make the content almost universally accessible, meaning that people don't have to download an app. There may not be system requirements, so maybe everyone that has a Mac can only download Sketch, for example. But if you were to have a website to create things in, so maybe like InVision or Balsamiq or Marvel, everyone with an internet-enabled computer can actually access that product. So it doesn't need to be local or specific to an operating system. It's just available to anyone who can connect to the internet. Additionally, you can take your desktop design and make it responsive so that it degrades well into mobile and tablet, and then scales up well when it comes back to desktop or even larger form factors. So as you approach your project, please work with your teammates to determine which of these two are the better ways to approach your product. So there won't be there's not one right answer to this. but it really requires consultation with your teammates and for you to consider some of these points before you make a decision to move on. So please go ahead and look at the discussion board and discuss amongst yourselves kind of the pros and cons of the different ways that you can design for a desktop experience and come to a conclusion by the end of the discussion so that you can move forward with your project. All right, I hope that was helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions on this.